My name's Tony Wilson. I'm in this unit that deals with self and identity. I should own up to being 38 years old, white, Anglo-Saxon, Catholic until I was 7. Then I was asked if I wanted to go to church anymore, and I said no, and so we didn't. Then I had a relatively middle-class, privileged upbringing, a bit of an aspiration to be a footballer for a while before becoming a writer. And I've written 2 novels, one called Players, and my latest is called Making News. I have permission to plug it once per talk. So here it is, Making News, the story of a 16, 17-year-old boy and girl who are coming to grips with a sex scandal that hits the dad of the boy. And it's, I think, a good school book for teachers in the audience about celebrity and the media and new media. Today, however, we're going to be talking about a much greater work, and it's the film Witness. This is part of the continuing series here at the Wheeler Centre called Texts in the City, where we're going to be looking at Year 12 texts and really trying to find the love that people have for them. Because apart from the kind of slog that you guys are going to go through with these texts, they are great works of art, and it's never too hard to dredge around to find someone who really wants to enthuse about them. And today, the piece of art is Witness. In terms of my relationship with the Amish, I just want to quickly mention that of the characters depicted in the film, I guess I'm the loudmouthed American woman who screams at the Amish whether she could take their photo, because I have been to Pennsylvania County and I have secretly driven around behind those buggies trying to get photos. So that's my secret shame. I've owned up to it now, and now we're going to get on with some of the more sympathetic characters in the film. And to do that, I've got a special guest to introduce. Our guest today is Mac Gudgeon, an acclaimed Australian writer for film and theatre. He was the co-writer with Jan Sardi of Ground Zero, which won 4 AFIs, and he also wrote the screenplay for The Delinquents and Wind, the Francis Ford Coppola Zoetrope production. And Mac's script editing credits include Wolf Creek, which many of you will know, that screened at 2005 Sundance and Cannes, and Snowtown, which will be released this year in 2011. He's written for TV. He's written and produced documentaries, and he was the winner of the 2007 Foxtel Fellowship for Excellence in Television Writing. He's been a mainstay of our creative industry here in Melbourne. It's my great pleasure to talk about the Peter Weir film Witness today, Mac Gudgeon.
There you go.
Now, Mac, I'd like to give the teachers and students a bit of an idea of what the people who sit in these chairs do. Can you give us an idea of what you've got coming up and the sort of job that you would have had to produce that?
The job of a screenwriter is akin to being a juggler, because not all that you write gets produced. So you have to have 3 or 4 projects all in the air at the same time. One you'll be researching, one you'll be writing a first draft, one you'll be writing a shooting script, and one you'll be arguing with the producer about all the scenes that were cut out. So it's a very peripatetic life, but an interesting life. It's different from any other form of writing because the audience doesn't actually read your writing, they see and hear your writing. And there's a difficult process that goes from the written word on the page to the images on the screen. If you want to be a writer and you're precious about your work, don't be a screenwriter. Be a novelist or a poet, because then you only have to deal with an editor. As a screenwriter, you're dealing with producers, directors, actors, editors, cinematographers. And everyone wants to take your script, which is the blueprint for the film or the television program, and they want to make it their own by changing things. Sometimes that can be frustrating, sometimes it's joyous, depending on who you're collaborating with. Sometimes you look at the finished product and think, that has nothing to do with what I wrote. Or you may look at it and think, that's better than what I wrote. So it's an interesting career. And the good thing about being a screenwriter is we're paid more than novelists, most novelists in this country anyway. So you can earn a buck out of it. And at its best, it's exciting and interesting because you're working with really interesting people, good actors, good directors. At its worst, it can you can feel like slashing your wrists, but that seems to be the path of a writer, no matter what discipline they're pursuing.
Well, let's do a nod to the writers of Witness, because screenwriters, in my view, are the forgotten stars of films, given that the idea often comes from screenwriters, or usually comes from screenwriters, and there's even been times at the Oscars where the screenwriter category has fallen off the main event and been, sort of cut for the evening viewing. The writers of this film, Witness, are William Keighley, Earl W. Wallace and Pamela Wallace. What do you think of this screenplay, and what do you think of this film?
I think it's a wonderful film, and it's because of the screenplay. It is a wonderful film. In film and television we talk about genre. It's a fancy French word for the sort or the style of how the story is told. This is a Western, basically. If you look at many of the Westerns made in the 40s, 50s and 60s, what happens is you've got a community in trouble, a lonely stranger comes into town, fixes up the problem, rides his horse off into the sunset at the end. You could also say it's the thriller romance, because there's a bit of both of those. But it's a beautifully constructed screenplay, traditional 3 acts. Most screenplays for feature films have 3 acts. This follows that pattern. I love it because it's visual, and a lot of that is to do, of course, with Peter Weir, the Australian director who directed it. It was his first Hollywood film. And it's interesting, he always thought when he made it that it was probably the most lightweight of his films, but I think in many ways it may outlast most of his other films just because of the quality of the story. Of course, it has lots of themes which become apparent as the story unfolds, but what's interesting to me mostly is how spare the script is. And there isn't a huge amount of dialogue compared to most films. It's very lean, and Weir manages to turn the words on the page into images on the screen that convey a lot of the dialogue, and you find you don't need the dialogue. The last film I had was released last year, was called Last Ride, with Hugo Weaving in it, and I'm a great fan of letting the pictures tell the story. It's the difference between cinema and literature. We have a huge screen. We can tell a story very quickly with pictures. And of course, it's an old adage, but it's nonetheless true that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And what I tried to do in Last Ride was make it as spare as possible, have as little dialogue as possible. And they're the sort of films I like. It's different for television because you can't afford what you can in a film. You can't afford to take a scene outside to an interesting location. You have to shoot a lot of stuff in controllable locations like inside a room, so you often use a lot more dialogue. Witness works on a number of levels. It works as a cop crime thriller, it works as a romance, and it also works as a clash between modern materialistic, individualistic society and the Amish society, which is very simple, non-materialistic, spiritual. And I think that's a really nice contrast. And the idea of placing a cop thriller inside an Amish community was a brilliant idea. It was originally a storyline for an old television series called Gunsmoke, which was, the storyline was rejected. The writers took it, I think, and the producer 20 years later took it to every studio in Hollywood, and they all rejected it. Everybody said who'd be interested in the Amish. But of course, Weir took it and made it something special, I think.
It's incredible. And for those, I always think there's a bit of a misconception that art is in the art house cinema and Hollywood is kind of a churn machine of scripts. And yet Hollywood at its best, I think, produces art of the same calibre as the best art house films. And this is clearly a Hollywood film with Hollywood structure, as you said. But I sort of thought, I was watching it 2 nights ago and thinking, this whole film, the premise of this film, the screenwriter's initial idea is that a cop must hide out in an Amish community. That is the heart of this film. That's the longest distance of the film is spent with this, Harrison Ford, John Book character, having to spend all that time in the Amish community. And a good screenwriter has to solve a whole lot of problems for that to be a believable premise. And I thought I was going to ask you just to number off a few of them, to sort of, if you were given that problem, we want a film about a cop that's investigating a murder with a witness that hangs out in an Amish community for a long time. How does that become a believable setup? What are the things that the screenwriter had to check off the list so that viewers didn't say, no, that wouldn't happen, that's not realistic?
I think it's very elegant the way it was done. And there are, first of all, you have to get the Amish witness out of their community into the hard-edged world of Philadelphia and the crime. Then you have to make the witness. You have to. It's easy if the witness is an adult. It's much more interesting if it's a child, because the child can't verbalise a lot. Especially because this child, what's his name? Samuel is so young. Then you've got the thing that John Book, the Harrison Ford character, realises that the murderer is one of his own, one of his comrades, someone within the police force. So then you have the problem of how to disappear John Book and the witness so they won't be murdered. And of course, the obvious solution that occurs to Book is, I'll hide in the Amish community. And the great thing is that it takes the cops who are trying to kill the witness and John Book a long time to find out in which Amish community is, because they don't have telephones, so that's great. As a screenwriter, you've knocked out the telephone. And
the destruction of the file as well is quite convenient. You know, the assistant is pulled on side as a trustworthy ally, and so you get rid of the file. And it's got to be that no one else has the names of these. Well, they had the names, didn't they? But they just didn't have the addresses. So it was kind of like finding a needle in literally a whole lot of Amish haystacks. So it's that. And then I think the other thing that was great is that the Amish wouldn't normally have John Book. Like, the natural reaction of the Amish is, we're not going to take him, and yet the setup of Samuel's life is in danger without this guy. If he goes back out there into the world, the next person they come for is Samuel. That's a good enough. That's a good enough driver to keep John Book in the. So it comes from both ends. Book needs to go there because he's injured, and the Amish want to keep him. I take issue because you said at the beginning that the writer, worked out all this out. The writer probably didn't work it all out in the beginning. What the writer probably did was begin the journey. Yeah. And then came to these points where you figure, God, what am I going to do about the file? And you'd sit there, as I do, for a long period of time, staring at the ceiling, wondering what you're going to do with the file, and then something occurs to you. And people think that great scripts are just born. They just come out of nowhere. They take probably the average film script probably goes through 10 drafts. So that's 10 goes trying to iron out the wrinkles in it, trying to work out how the plot will work best, how the characters will be portrayed on the screen. So it's a long and arduous process. And of course, Weir, as the director and the actors and the producer, changed the script. If you read the original script, there's a lot of changes. And that's for a lot of reasons. Some are financial, some are for story reasons. And sometimes the actor, someone like Harrison Ford, has the power to change a scene because
you don't get the film made unless Harrison Ford's in it. So if he doesn't like a scene, he'll suggest changes or they'll do it differently on the day.
What about the romance element? Can you give us your impressions of it? I guess it seems like a doomed romance, I guess, from the start. Is that your impression?
Yeah, I think it's doomed. You realise right up front that it's a doomed relationship because Rachel and John Book come from such disparate cultures. They're so far apart. She's been born and bred in an Amish community. He's been born and bred we suppose, in Philadelphia. He's a hard-edged cop in a pretty tough world. She's the sort of the female pillar of a family in the Amish world. For them to come together, he would have had to become Amish or she would have had to leave. And I don't think that was ever on the cards. And which is part of the joy, of course, of the romance. Because although it's doomed, there's a part of us that hopes in the end, yes, the lovers will get together and ride off in the Volkswagen station wagon into the sunset, but it's not going to happen. But it's a beautifully constructed romance because it starts off with them not liking each other. She doesn't like John Book because he carries a gun and is involved in a violent society. He doesn't know much about the Amish, but you can tell he's not that enamoured with them, thinks they're strange, foreign, alien almost, which they are in a sense. And through the course of the unfolding of the story, we see that, of course, they have things in common, which brings them together. They're attracted to each other, but in the end, it can't happen.
Because he drinks that solo in such a rugged man way, doesn't he?
Well,
so that's
it's bittersweet. Well, it's interesting because when I was looking at that's the way she looks at him when he drinks the lemonade. That first time he guzzles it down in a greedy sort of materialist, non-caring way. But later, when they're building the barn, someone gives him a lemonade and he takes a sip and then gives it to someone else to have a drink. So I think it's a very subtle and interesting way of showing that he's absorbing some of the sense of community because he's been in that community for some time and he's working with them to construct the barn, and it's starting to change him. And his life is starting to change her. And it's interesting, that moment when they have the big kiss in the dusk in the field, that she takes her bonnet off before that moment, symbolically putting aside the sort of the outer shell of the Amish and just revealing herself a woman. And of course there's that wonderful moment when she's washing herself and she's bare-breasted and he comes to the door and he sees her and she's there and she's so innocent in a sense. There's a feeling of innocence that she can stand there bare-breasted in front of him. But there's also that deep womanly thing that, okay, this is what I've got, come and get it. And
of course that's I think the famous quote, what's he say the next day, if we had made love last night, either you'd have to leave or I'd have to stay or something.
Yeah.
And that kind of...
But of course the other interesting thing is we never see them consummate their love beyond a kiss. And of course it's true in sometimes in life, if we've all had relationships, I'm sure, sometimes in life it's the foreplay that's much more interesting than the rest. And in romance, of course, and in film we want to see the romance, we want to see the foreplay. Two sweaty bodies in bed. God, if you've watched enough films and televisions, you've pretty much seen everything that's available in that department. It's much more interesting seeing two people come together, seeing the obstacles to them having a relationship and them overcoming the relationship, and sticking to all the rules of genre, coming together at the end. So it's not a Hollywood ending, which is interesting because in some ways it's quite a Hollywood film, in some ways it's more an art film, but I think it's a wonderful film, particularly because it isn't a Hollywood ending. They were brave enough, Weir and the writers were brave enough to say, these two people can't get together, it's just not going to happen.
In terms of the rules of genre, you said that. What are the rules of a film like this? If you're going to call it a crime thriller or a western or a romance, what are the ingredients that must be in these sort of films?
Well, first of all, you have to have the status quo, and we see the status quo in Witness with the beginning of the film is, we see, which starts with shots of wheat, the sort of rural thing there. Then we go to the funeral, the Amish funeral. So this is a very ordered society, and as the camera roams around the house during the wake, you see the men sitting and talking and drinking, and in the background you see the women doing the domestic work that goes towards organising a wake. And it's like this is a very stable society. Everyone has their role and they stay in their role. So that's how you start. You always start with the status quo, and then Rachel and Samuel have to leave the community and go by train, and then what happens is something has to disturb the status quo. There has to be what we call a disturbance, and that disturbance, of course, is Samuel seeing the policeman having his throat cut in the toilet of the railway. So you've got your status quo, then you have a disturbance, and then the next thing is, okay, this looks like it's going to be a pretty straightforward case. The kid's going to identify the killer from a list of photos. He sees the photo of the killer, but it's not who we all think it is, some hood or some gangster. It's actually someone in the police force. So again, the status quo is disturbed. So it's a constant, something happens, something disturbs it, something happens. It's cause and effect. And all good stories are driven by the engine of cause and effect. Something happens, disturbance, something else happens. And where Witness veers away from the usual rules of the genre is to take all the main characters and put them back in the Amish community. And that's really its only variance from the usual genre rules.
What about
and also, of course, as I spoke before, there's 3 acts. Shakespeare can be all his plays. He may have like 7 acts in some of them, or 6 acts, but in actual fact you can break them into 3 acts. And all stories have a 3-act structure. Even a joke has a 3-act structure. There's what we call the setup, knock knock, who's there? That's the setup. The feed is, whatever the feed is, and then there's the punchline. So you've got the setup, the feed, and the punchline. Even in a short joke, there are 3 acts. And in almost all storytelling in the Western context, there are 3 acts. The 3 acts in this is the first act finishes when John Book is shot at in the underground car park by the Danny Glover character, the bad cop. The second act finishes with a kiss in the field, and the third act obviously finishes with the last shot. Another disturbance is when you realise also that the head of the police is also in on the crime.
Are there any points, I talked about how I thought the screenwriters closed a lot of the questions an audience member would have. I remember my wife was sitting next to me and she's saying, of course, they check that. They check the toilet doors. They definitely check the toilet doors. And then, sure enough, just as she was despairing, they went and checked the toilet doors. And it was a fantastically tense and an excellent part of that scene. Are there any points in that film, like I think you've watched it quite recently, where you thought, I'm not sure I believe that? Do you see faults, I guess, in the screenplay as a screenwriter?
I always see faults, but in Witness, it's pretty hard to find fault. I think it's a beautifully constructed script and it tells the story really well. And I mean, that's what screenwriters are. We're storytellers. It just happens you don't read our stuff, you see it on a screen. And if you're a good screenwriter, what the screenwriter does is invisible. We can see what the director does, the way the camera moves, the way the actors move, the shots that the director and the cinematographer have chosen to take. We can see what the actors do. We can never see, if it's a good script, you never see what the screenwriter's done because you don't ask those questions, or those holes in the plot don't occur to you while it's happening. And it's the ironic thing for screenwriters that our best work no one ever sees, in a sense.
The students here will be writing on self and identity. I'm sure they're quite interested on the topic. In particular, can you talk about the changes that John Book goes through in terms of, I guess, self and identity that come as a result of spending time with the Amish? And I guess also Eli gets very disappointed in Rachel at one point. What changes are happening with her, and in what ways is she, I guess, breaking the rules of the Amish?
Well, she's breaking the rule in that she's brought a non-Amish person into the community. She's also staring at him with an open gaze. And if you look in the film, when other women, Amish women, are relating to Amish men, they always keep their eyes down because the gaze can be taken as a sexual signal. The way Book changes is interesting because I believe this also, one of the themes in this story is the Old Testament versus the New Testament. When we look at the Amish, we think Old Testament. But in actual fact, they're pacifists. And if you read the Old Testament's full of sex, treachery, slaughter. The New Testament, Christ talks about turning the other cheek, forgiveness, that violence is not a way to achieve an end. So in a sense, Book represents the Old Testament. We would think he wouldn't because he seems to be a contemporary man compared to the Amish who seem to hark back. And it's a clash of those two very diametrically opposed parts of Christianity. Book is changed in lovely ways. He's changed from being just a full-on individualist cop by the community he's forced into living with. And that's what... There's two scenes everyone remembers from this film. If you ask people who saw this film in 1984 when it was shot, and you say, do you remember anything about it? They'll remember two scenes. The two scenes are the raising of the barn, where the whole of the Amish community comes together to build a barn in one day, traditional thing that they do for each other. And John Book is drawn into doing this. He's obviously a carpenter because he makes a little toy for Samuel, and he also fixes the birdhouse that he knocks over when he's passes out behind the wheel of his car. He's a carpenter, but he has to work with a whole bunch of other people. So his individualistic ways are subsumed by the community. And the other way, noticeable way he's changed, I think, is in the last sequence where the three cops turn up to kill him and Samuel, and there's a feeling I always feel in there that if he could get away with not shooting someone, he would. But in the end, he has to shoot someone. She's changed by... I don't think she really changes that much, to tell you the truth, and that's why she stays in the end. I think she's changed in the fact that she's willing to exhibit her sexuality more than she would or could in the Amish community. The most interesting moment for me as far as change is the head cop when he They come out of the silo. He's chasing John Book. He has a shotgun, and by that time Samuel has alerted the rest of the community, and a lot of the men have come, and Eli's there and Rachel's there, and the cop realises that he can't shoot John Book because there are so many witnesses, he'd have to kill them all, which would be impossible. And so it's the strength of the community, then just the sheer weight of numbers of a community that has solidarity and believes in something that frustrates the intentions of the head cop. But the last shot you see of the head cop is he turns his back away from them and he drops to his knees. It's almost like supplication or a moment of prayer that this man has, who is so powerful in the ordinary world, is reduced to a supplicant in the face of the strength of the community. And it's the last moment you see him.
About the way that Samuel witnesses the murder, what did you actually think of the emotion in his face when he saw that?
That was the hardest scene to shoot, because Peter Weir didn't want the young actor to see the violence because he thought it may have a bad effect upon him. So they shot the violence happening, and then the young actor had to do all his facial expressions off the camera, which is very hard for a mature actor to, let alone a young kid. So it took a lot of time, and Peter Weir had to get pretty intense with the young actor for him to
damage him in other ways than seeing a murder.
Satisfy for the amount of horror that a young child would see in that. And the child's face is interesting because in a lot of scenes I think it's almost unreadable, which children are, because they don't understand a lot of stuff that goes on around them. To a young child, a lot of the universe apparently appears to be random and anarchic, and in some ways just that kid's face works because it is hard to read sometimes.
Since no one from the outside world can go into an Amish community, essentially, how do you make sure you have that degree of authenticity in the movie, and how do you know that you're actually abiding to Amish culture?
Well, a lot of work goes into that. First of all, a lot of work for the writers to be able to write about a community which is, the two people who wrote it weren't Amish. So as a screenwriter, if you're writing about a community you don't know about, then you have to do a lot of research, and that can take many forms. It can be as simple as looking at Wikipedia, but of course you're only going to get the surface of something from that. You can read books, you can watch films or documentaries made about it, but the best way for a writer is to talk to actual people who are involved or know something about it. I believe the writers of Witness talked to a number of Amish people who'd left the community, and that's where they got a lot of their information from. And then, of course, the director and the actors have to, and Kelly, what's her name, who played Rachel McGillis, is it? She went and lived with an Amish family for a month to find out, with a mother who had 7 children, and the father had died. So she lived with them for a month to find out, A, how they spoke, their accent, and how they deport themselves, the things they do every day, the rituals of their life. And of course, the director also has to do that. The Amish didn't want to contribute to the film. They didn't read the script. They were happy to rent their buggies, etc., out to the production, but none of them would appear in front of the camera. They don't like being photographed. So it's always that problem that I'm sure Tony has, any writer has, when you're writing about something you don't intimately know about. You have to find a way of finding out about it, usually talking to someone who's a member of that community or group, or subculture, whatever it is the best way to go. But the good writers, in a sense, are chameleons. We can become someone else. And for a screenwriter, when I invent a character, I become that character. I have to. And I have to believe that what that character is saying or doing, they believe is the right thing for them to do or say at that time, even if they're the worst homicidal maniac. For a while there, I have to become a homicidal maniac, and I have to work out how I think, how a homicidal maniac would think. Because you can't convey a character unless you're willing to stand in their shoes. Now, of course, all human beings have similar needs. The three basic needs are shelter, food and sex. That's the fact of it. If we don't have sex, we don't continue the species. So we know, as a writer, I know that every person in this room has those three basic needs. But for me to become you, then I have to know deeper things about you. You know, what your child... And when I invent a character, I do what I call an interview, where I interview myself as the character, and I begin before that character was born. What were the character's parents like? Were they middle class, working class, rich, poor, well educated, not well educated? And then my character is born, and then I interview that character right through till the moment they appear on the screen. Where did they go to school? What subjects were they good at? Did they have brothers and sisters? Because if you're an only child, your life is quite different from a family of 7 siblings. If you're beautiful, your life is going to be different from someone who's plain. If you're rich, your life is going to be different from someone who's poor. If you're well educated, your life is different from someone who's not well educated. So I have to know in my mind, before I actually even start writing, who these characters are. And what's happened in Witness is that the writers and the director and the actors have tried to inhabit the skin of the characters. And sometimes that works brilliantly, sometimes it fails, but the best films, it works brilliantly, usually.
Well, Mac Gudgeon, thank you very much. That last answer, for those who are looking for the sort of course material, I guess, on any question about self and identity, you can hardly have it better expressed than the way that someone who tries to create characters thinks about self and identity. And it seems like a good way to go out on that description of how your characters are born, and to conclude our discussion of some wonderful characters and a wonderful film. And you're lucky to be studying it, and I think and hopefully you've enjoyed today, and best of luck with the year to come.